Okay, so there have been several comments I've received on several streams when I talk about my preferred design philosophy for magic in games and how D&D 5e's magic system doesn't really live up to that design philosophy. And those comments have, I don't think purposefully or willfully, but seemed to misunderstand what I want and the motivations behind my design philosophy. I want to make it very clear. I don't want magic to be weaker. I don't want it. This is not a Marshall Caster debate. I know that is one of the internet's favorite debates, and I am not here to participate in it. I do not want magic to be weaker. Maybe Marshalls could use a few more options, but that's not what this video is about. Stay on topic. Rather, my design philosophy focuses on an aspect of 5e that I don't love, which is that I would consider it more of a tug of war style system, or you could even call it reactionary magic system. It is a system where there are very powerful effects that casters just do, but then there are also very powerful defensive resources. And while I love the players feeling powerful, I think that the way that the defensive resources are designed is not fun at all, but it's necessary for how the offensive resources are designed. Two of these specific things really get under my skin, those being legendary resistance and concentration. I'm also not a huge fan of counterspell, but I don't need to explain that. When I explain legendary resistance, you'll get the picture. My big problem with legendary resistance is that it turns casting from something interesting and fun and dynamic with a ton of decision points, where you have to evaluate the battlefield and your allies and their positions and try to figure out what's the best spell to use in this specific scenario, and turns it into just burning a legendary resistance. It reduces all of your spells text to a hammer trying to beat down the gate of LR. And I don't think that is interesting. I think that takes the best part of 5e's magic and kind of trivializes it. But like I said, it's required. When you have very low-level spells like Hold Person, you have to have something like Legendary Resistance for your really high CR creatures. It's just required. And we'll see that even more with something like Concentration. Now, Concentration at its base, I don't love because it's what I would call an overloaded mechanic. And for any of you that have programming experience, you might sort of know what I'm getting at. Concentration does two separate things. It takes on two separate jobs and roles within the 5e magic system. On one hand, it is a determiner of what I would call variable value, which I think is already kind of strange within the 5e design space. I can't speak for older generations, at least in detail. But especially for 5e, this is not a common thing within other areas of the design. Take something like Fighter's Action Surge. There's no variable value there. You use an Action Surge charge, and you get another action. It's actually it's very straightforward. There is absolute guaranteed value when you spend that resource. And that's kind of what all of 5e is designed off of. I kind of often refer to it as a resource management game. You have free resources with cantrips and normal attacks. You have consumables that you trade in resources to get other kinds of like one-use prep resources. And then there's everything else in the middle, what I would call the rechargeable resources, right? These are things that recharge on short rest, dawn, long rest, and that's the real meat of the game. It is how do you expend these at a rate that is protective so that you maybe have resources for an unexpected challenge down the road, but is going to get you through this without dying. That's the interesting part of D&D and especially 5e combat. And Concentration adds an odd amount of variability to some of those resources. It is something where you cast it, and if it goes its entire casting time or its entire duration, it's incredibly powerful. But if it only goes for its very initial duration, it's not very powerful at all. And I'm not against this wholly, but it definitely feels like something that is more within a class identity than the identity of half of the classes in the game that engage with spellcasting. Like, it feels much more like a wild magic sorcerer feature, right? At least to me. The other thing that concentration does, which is what makes it overloaded, is it prevents the overlapping of certain resources that might be too strong if they did overlap. I understand why they did it. It's similar to Legendary Resistance, with so many powerful spells that, if you get all the way through them, are incredibly strong. You want a little bit of restriction on them, but it also removes some of the most fun parts of RPGs. Like in hero or fantastical genres like this, there are typically two very fun ways to combo things. There is either the kind of hero shooter Overwatch style where you combine abilities together, think like Zarya Graviton with a Tracer Pulse Bomb, right? That is combining two resources from two different characters together to create an enhanced effect. And I think that D&D 5e does this a lot. It's very clearly part of the design philosophy, and I love it. But there's another aspect that I think is trying to be very prevalent in D&D, but concentration very distinctly fights against, which is within RPGs, you oftentimes want to combo with yourself. You can sort of think about this like the Slay the Spire mechanics, right? The cards that you get over the course of the game all combine with each other to create effects that are larger than the sum of their parts, all within a character. This is why we have like character building and why we have lots of different options for builds. And it is why, even though this is a game where you have a on-the-spot balancer with the DM that can very specifically balance counters to whatever build the party creates, you still have certain character builds that are banned at certain tables. I think the most infamous of which is probably the coffee lock. It is a very integral part of the game, this build aspect to it, comboing within yourself. And it's something that concentration actively fights against. It says, yeah, you can combo all you want, but not these certain spells. And again, I understand it. These spells are very, very powerful. And that's where some of my design philosophy comes into play, some of my changes, which are very simple. And again, I understand why people view them as nerfing spellcasting, but I really don't want to do that with them. So I will try to caveat them as I go. Because I would rather have spells have trade-offs or potentially more risk towards getting even the initial effect, but then have the resulting effect still be very big and fun. And the thing is, we already have that. Like, 5e already has a mechanic for that. Casting time. There are several spells that have 8-hour, 4-hour, 1-hour even casting times, where if you get interrupted within it, the spell fizzles, but if you get all the way through the casting time, you get this huge, powerful effect. But as far as I'm aware, at least, it makes a big jump right now from 1 action or bonus action all the way up to like 10 minutes, which is basically impossible to get off within the course of a combat. I would much rather see the designers lean into this by making lower casting times that are a little bit higher than 1 action, 2 actions, 3 actions, something like that. Put them into seconds, 12 second, 18 second, anything like that. Put an amount of risk on even the initial casting, and then you can have this huge blowout benefit that we don't need concentration to restrain anymore. We put all of the risk on the casting time. That's more interesting for marshals and the rest of the party as well. You know that your caster is charging up this big effect and you have to protect them until they can get it off. And once they do, ooh, the battle's gonna change in your favor. It means that you don't need legendary resistance. All you have to do is make the most impactful spells, things like Hold Person, have more than one action of casting time. That gives enemies an opportunity to interact with it before it goes off. That's way more dynamic to me personally than having this concentration mechanic where, it's already gone off, so then another thing has to interact with the caster. That's way more complicated and kind of unpredictable and unreliable. It's why anything that is designed to be run as a single combatant at high level has to have legendary resistance, because if you can get off something like Hold Person, there's nothing left to break the concentration. So you either have to have legendary resistance or you have to design a combat with a bunch of minions. But if you make it a longer casting time, then the person that it's targeting can interact with it before it goes off. Again, in my opinion, much more dynamic. And to highlight a potential caveat or gotcha that some people might already be typing into the comments, I'm very aware that concentration is already a part of casting times longer than an action, but this kind of drives my point home. Casting time can already handle all of the things that concentration would handle separately, so why do we have this totally separate kind of version of concentration? It's a mechanic that is all over the place, is doing so many different things in so many different ways, and I just want to squeeze it back down to not only allow more consistency within rulings and mechanics, but to also allow more design space for enemies and combat encounters in general. I would also, in general, like to see more spells with trade-offs. My initial idea is sort of based on the Gaze of Two Minds Warlock invocation. An invocation which admittedly is famously bad, but that's because the effect is not powerful enough for its trade-off. If you look at something like Hold Person, you could maybe even lower its level one stage, but have it to where, yes, you paralyze the target, but you yourself are paralyzed as well, giving a little bit more of a push and pull to the spell itself, rather than having to bake in these defensive resources to spellcasting at large or the actual defender specifically. This gives so much more flexibility. These two things, putting trade-offs within the spells themselves and utilizing casting time in larger applications. And I want to focus in on what I just said. I don't want to nerf magic. If we add a detriment like a longer casting time to Hold Person, then once it goes off, it can only be interrupted by the caster themselves choosing to dismiss it. If we add a trade-off, like the paralysis actually affecting the caster as well, let's lower the level from second to first. I want these spells to still have the same impact on the game. I just want to move all of it within the spells to provide a lot more design freedom as well as enemy design freedom. I don't want to be required to insert legendary resistance to make a weird little mini game of trying to burn off this enemy's legendary resistance. I just want the spells to do what they do. I want them to work and feel powerful, like Barbarian Rage or Monk Key or Fighter Action Surge. They just have resources that just work. And also, again, I'm not against the concept of like variable value or any of this sort of stuff as class identities or subclass identities. I actually think that could be a really cool identity for the sorcerer, is that they can reduce casting time by half, or they can maybe just reduce it just squarely to one action, but then they have to go through the concentration sort of effect that 5e currently has. I think that'd be an awesome class identity. It would make them feel really distinct from the rest of spellcasters. But it would also hamper their ability to combo well within themselves. It would hamper their ability to get these really large effects because they would be so interruptible. That's the sort of thing that I think that 5e is built on, is customizing these combat encounters to the specific classes to either highlight them super positively or maybe challenge them a little bit more. But it becomes very hard to do that in high-level D&D with spellcasting. So you have to start introducing, again, all of these defensive resources that I think really hinder the design space as you get higher and higher. And I want to provide a very specific response to a specific comment. I won't put it on screen. I think they were totally in good faith and did bring up a good point of introducing these restrictions or complications to very specific spells might create friction between the players using versus not using those spells, which I don't wholly disagree with. I think that friction between using a feature versus not should be reduced as much as possible. But I think that the things that I'm proposing result in less friction than something like Legendary Resistance. I think Legendary Resistance is just full of friction. It puts a really odd decision point on what spells to use and when and how. And in terms of how this philosophy would affect things that are, currently handled by concentration, I think in terms of a friction standpoint, it's a bit of a wash. On one hand, it does put some barriers towards achieving certain effects, but on the other hand, it unlocks a whole new repertoire of effects where you can have one effect active and then go into another effect if you get the first one off. It allows a lot more self-comboing, which I think is very cool. And right now, to get that, there is an immense amount of friction and restriction. So I do understand how the initial appears that I'm just nerfing and introducing friction, but the backing philosophy is trying to unlock this new mode of play, essentially. This wider ranging ability to self-combo within your own build. So, like I said, I get it, but the overall design philosophy, I think, is about a wash in that respect. And I also want to reiterate, I haven't tested any of this at my table. I am not subjecting my players to my theoretical whims. These are just things that I've been thinking about a lot, especially given that we're having a big 5e revamp coming out very, very soon. I've been really thinking about what I would like to see out of 5e and its design, thinking about its strengths and its potential weaknesses, how we could highlight them. I think that the 5e combats and 5e in general is at its strongest when it is encouraging interesting decisions. And I don't think that Legendary Resistance makes for interesting decisions, and I don't think that Concentration does that either. Whereas leaning into casting time and removing concentration and introducing some trade-offs, I think presents much more interesting decision points within a combat or a general encounter. And that's basically it. There is not this big convoluted change that I would prefer be made to the magic of D&D. Largely, I just wish that the designers would lean into casting time a little bit more and would make some more trade-offs within the spells themselves. I think that that would just increase the freedom of design of both spells and enemies, which I think would be a good thing for everyone involved. But if you disagree, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if comments aren't your thing, I stream regularly, at least several times a week, so feel free to hop in if you ever see me live, and we can talk about it in chat. I love talking to my chat about these sorts of things, really bouncing them off other people with other experiences that might have different angles on these sorts of discussions. So feel free to hop in, and I can't wait to talk to you there.